Hello everybody, welcome to the Floating LiDAR Roadmap webinar from the Offshore Wind Accelerator. Today we're going to talk about the recent update to the roadmap and what does it mean for the industry. Today we have a good suite of speakers who are the authors of the update, including Marianne Cowan from DMGL, Detlef Stein from Multiversum, Brian Gribben from Fraser Nash Consultancy, and Julia Gottschall from Fraunhofer EWES. And I am Eloise Burnett from the Carbon Trust. So just a little bit of housekeeping on the webinar. If you have any problems with the sound, use the question function underneath on your panel that you should have with GoToWebinar. Also, we will be answering your questions in this webinar, so use the question section of your webinar function to ask us some questions, and if you want them to go to specific people, then do just note that down in the question section. The structure of today's webinar is I'm going to do a short update on Carbon Trust and the Offshore Wind Accelerator, and then talk a little bit about the context of the Floating LiDAR Roadmap update. And then I'm going to hand over to the project team, who will do a talk through different sections of the update to the roadmap, including the key changes, the summary of the changes, and then we'll move swiftly into the Q&A sessions to make sure we have a good discussion. The project team is listed there on the right, which I've already introduced, but yeah, hopefully some of those faces and names will be familiar. So the Carbon Trust and the Offshore Wind Accelerator, hopefully you may have heard of us, but I thought I'd touch on the program and what we've been doing for the last 10 years. So it's a joint industry program focusing on innovation and reducing the cost of offshore wind that's now been running for 10 years. We are funded by 9 developers and the Scottish Government, and we fund both large-scale demonstration projects and small research projects. And over the last 10 years, we've spent over 100 million euros on R&D. We've been working hard over the last 10 years, and hopefully the Floating LiDAR Roadmap update is testament to some of the progress that we can make when we work in a collaborative manner. So what has the Offshore Wind Accelerator been doing around floating LiDAR? We started way back in 2012, 2013 with demonstration projects where there was the floating LiDAR field trials, which was the first and largest of its kind, and I think is still the largest in the world in terms of deployments of floating LiDAR trials. We also at the same time have been working on desk-based documents to support the progress of LiDAR technology. Right at the beginning, back in 2013, the first roadmap came out, which was laid out the progress and the process for LiDAR technology to grow and move towards commercial stage. At the same time, we were looking at developing a recommended practice document so that we could standardize and encourage best practice when it came to deploying LiDAR systems, which we've also worked really closely with the IEA Task 32 group on over the years, and they now have a recommended practice document available too. And now we move to 2018, and the new roadmap, which was released earlier this week. Alongside that, we also have put together a deployments document, which lists all the deployments that we know have happened over the last, since the beginning of the technology, really, and up till earlier this year. And it's a really useful document which shows the amount and the breadth of deployments that have taken place over the last 10 years or so. I won't go into too much detail about the roadmap update myself. I'm going to hand over to the project team to allow them to go into more detail. But as I said, make sure you take this opportunity to ask questions, and I will talk to you all again at the end.
Thank you, Eloise. So yeah, it's Marianne here. So good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining the webinar. So most of you will likely already be familiar with the original Floating LiDAR Roadmap, but for the benefit of doubt, I'd like to spend just a few minutes providing some context before handing over to my fellow project team members who will talk you through the key changes in the updated roadmap in a bit more detail. So as we know, floating LiDAR technology is maturing, and the industry is seeing a growth in the deployment of this technology to support wind resource assessments. So as an industry going forward, we should expect to see more offshore wind farm projects seeking investment based on energy yield predictions derived from measurements from floating LiDAR devices. And what the OWA floating LiDAR roadmap seeks to do is encourage industry best practice and encourage industry consensus on the use of this technology. Which brings me on to the main objective of today's webinar, which is as follows. So the original roadmap was very successful and is widely recognised as the international industry framework for defining floating LiDAR technology maturity. So to ensure the continued success of version 2, it's really important that all key industry stakeholders are aware of the updated roadmap, what the key changes are, and how this affects them. And furthermore, we want to ensure that there is consistency throughout the industry in how the roadmap is interpreted and applied. So that's what we're seeking to address with this webinar today. So by encouraging this industry consensus around the application of floating LiDAR technology, we expect that to lead to increased confidence and increased bankability of the technology. And on this slide here, you'll find a link to the Carbon Trust website, which, as Eloise mentioned, the updated roadmap was published on earlier this week, alongside a supplementary guidance note, which is intended to provide a bit more background and advice on how to apply the roadmap. So quick recap of what the roadmap currently does. So the main thing it sets out is 3 different maturity stages for floating LiDAR technology. So they're defined as follows. We have baseline, stage 1, going up to pre-commercial, stage 2, and the top stage, the commercial stage, which is stage 3. So yeah, please do bear in mind those 3 maturity stages as we go through the presentation. So as part of the roadmap update, we engaged with stakeholders across the industry to understand the current status of floating LiDAR technology and the applications to date. So in general, there's been notable innovation and development of floating LiDAR technology, and the wind industry has definitely seen a growth in the deployment of floating LiDAR systems to support wind resource assessments since the original roadmap was published in 2013. So we produced a database from this industry engagement, which details all known floating LiDAR deployments, as Eloise mentioned earlier. This was published earlier this year and is also available on the Carbon Trust website. But just to bring to your attention a few key statistics from that. So the repository contains information about 84 known floating LiDAR deployments at the time of writing. So these consist of 13 different floating LiDAR systems deployed at approximately 40 locations, mostly in sites across Northern Europe, but also including North America and Taiwan. So of these 13 systems, stage 2 maturity has been independently reported for 7. Apologies for that. So yeah, independently reported for 7, and the graph shown here is representing the number of cumulative deployments at any one time of floating LiDAR systems. So you can see that there's a definite rise, definite increase after the original roadmap was published, which really underlined the requirement to provide an update to the roadmap, which means it remains suitable for use going forward. And just coming back to the number of systems that have currently reached stage 2, so we've got a little visual here which summarises the 7 systems which are at stage 2. So, having provided a little bit of context there, we'll move on to talk about the key updates. So I'll just give you a brief overview of what these are, and then I'll hand over to my project team members. So yeah, we did undertake extensive industry stakeholder engagement as part of this process, and used that to inform the key areas, focus areas for update for version 2 of the roadmap. These included clarifications, extensions, updates, and new material that have been included in version 2. And these can be categorized in the 6 main areas shown here. The first 4 of which we see are key changes that we'd want to bring to your attention in this webinar today. So we've provided an extended definition for stage 3, clarifying requirements for pre and post deployments, providing guidance on how to perform uncertainty calculations for floating LiDARs, and also looking at the impact of design changes to type maturity. So with that, I'll now hand over to my colleague Detlev Stein, who will talk through the extended definition for stage 3.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. Yeah, thanks, Marianne, for making this introduction to the key changes of the floating LiDAR roadmap, which we have tackled on our way. Just trying to see. Okay, looks I have controls now. Looking at the first part, which is maybe the most important part, supposedly the most important part of the changes to the prerequisite to the roadmap is the prerequisites for the stage 3. So we got a clear answer from the industry that the needs to call a floating LiDAR system commercial have to be specified during the course of this update. And so we came up with a number of specifications which are mainly focused on the reliability of a floating LiDAR system rather than on the accuracy, because the accuracy is thought to be there already, though not necessarily fully consistent in terms of availability of the systems and availability of the data. So in that respect, we thought we need more evidence from verification trials on one hand side, and from real project deployments, commercial deployments, which we call early deployments, thanks to the fact that these have been pre-commercial systems already. So, and we put that down to a number of 6 verification trials, which are needed on top of the stage 2 requirements that had been fulfilled already by the seven mentioned systems. And those 6 verification trials consist of 3 long and 3 shorter campaigns, which all have to fulfill the stage 2 best practice data accuracy criteria for the related KPIs, and some increased acceptance criteria with regards to system and data availability. Furthermore, it is required for a fully traceable uncertainty assessment, to which we come later on when Julia has her voice, to have 3 classification trials, full classification cards according to the IEC, to be completed and give the handle on whatever sensitivity assessments of the LiDAR wind data error or uncertainty. And then last but not least, we required 5 early commercial project deployments to be completed and independently reported on, which as well we have certain requirements then on system and data availability throughout these campaigns. And so the consequences are that any of these stage 3 prerequisites is that any third party verifying the stage 3 maturity for a floating LiDAR system has to be clear on these. Of course, for a bankable resource assessment, floating LiDAR should at least be stage 2. But then the stage 3 floating LiDAR, from a stage 3 floating LiDAR, the users and the industry should expect a much higher degree of reliability. And so, in essence, a concise floating LiDAR wind data uncertainty assessment is achievable. That includes both stringent verification and as well classification components. I'm trying to change this. Sorry, so 14 is the next slide. So this slide gives a little bit more insight on the actual availability requirements, which have been increased from the stage 2 acceptance criteria for both system availability and data availability, where we increased the system availability from 90 to 95% for the monthly system availability and from 95 to 97% to the overall system availability. And then with regards to data availability, accepting that that is potentially the more important KPI for users and developers and energy yield analysts. So we increased the requirement for the monthly post-process data availability from 80 to 85%, being aware that this is quite a challenging hurdle to be taken by a system. And with regards to the overall post-process data availability, we increased the requirement from 85 to 90%. So maybe in this context, it should be noted that it is recognized it is a quite stringent criterion, in particular on wind data availability. However, as we see, not unjust compared to well-serviced map masts, where we see similar, maybe even higher data availabilities. And by the way, stage 3 is not necessarily easy. It's not thought to be easy to be achieved, as the technology as a whole actually needs some improvement. And so it's actually not just about repeating stage 2 performances by purely adding that these systems are improving in providing more reliable data sets in terms of reliability and data availability mainly. So over to the next slide. For some reason, that's a little bit slow here. Okay, so now for the KPIs with regards to the acceptance criteria, in the former roadmap there had already been acceptance criteria for all these data accuracy KPIs for mean wind speed and mean wind direction, and they were divided into best practice and minimum. And minimum was enough to have passed when achieving the stage 2. Now for achieving stage 3, all trials and verifications where a wind measurement reference is available, be it well-equipped IC compliant map mast, or as the roadmap now allows as well a well-proven and verified fixed LiDAR, those best practice acceptance criteria have to be applied, and this is true then for all the mentioned verifications, 6 verifications which have been named early on. Then going to the next slide, so that this slide summarizes more or less the needs in terms of number of verification trials and number of classifications and number of commercial deployments, distinguishing to remind you again, on stage 3, so there we required a single type verification campaign lasting for 6 months and meeting the stage 2 availability and data accuracy KPIs, at least at its minimum acceptance criterion, whereas now at stage 3 we require, in terms of the floating LiDAR type verification, that the stage 2 type verification has been passed, obviously, and that this and in addition to that, we require that the data accuracy KPIs meet stage 2 best practice. And then for the floating LiDAR unit verifications, those 6, so 3 longer and 3 shorter trials, we are talking about the longer ones in terms of lasting at least 3 months. The shorter ones, well, that may be typically 1 month long lasting verification campaigns. They need to be uninterrupted, single campaign each, and the availability KPIs and the data accuracy KPIs have to be according to the stage 3 or stage 2 best practice. By the way, the longer campaigns may as well count for the needed classification trials, and the same is true for the first longer type verification. That may as well be used as one of the 3 classification trials. Well, and then we have the 3 classification trials, which are typically lasting 3 months. And in the end, we have the 5 commercial campaigns, which should at least last 12 months and fulfill the stage 3 acceptance criteria. And I think that it is for my part. And then I hand over, I guess, to Brian.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. This is Brian Gribben. Thank you, Detlev. I'll just move on to the next slide if I can. Okay, so with this next slide, we seek to address the question of what does all this mean for the requirements for pre-deployment verifications. In particular, when you have achieved stage 3, then what does that mean then for pre-deployment verification? So starting at the beginning here, current practice, let's remind ourselves, is that all floating LiDAR systems require a pre-deployment unit verification. And that is to comply with an overall requirement for traceable uncertainty. That's where we are just now. Further guidance on that is provided on the recommended practice document, which is available from IEA and from the Carbon Trust website. So that's where we are just now, pre-deployment unit verifications for floating LiDAR system. Of course, there's a challenge associated with that. There's pressure, and I think everybody wants to see a reduction in the cost and time burden on wind resource assessments. And you know, as maturity increases, maybe there's an opportunity to do that while maintaining accuracy of measurements. And actually, stage 3 maturity level does actually provide you with an opportunity there, because what's embodied in stage 3, having attained stage 3, is that you have a body of evidence there across a range of deployment conditions. If you think back to the table that Detlev showed in the previous slide, if you achieve that, you've got a significant body of evidence there. What that means is that offers a route to reducing the requirements for a full at-sea floating LiDAR system pre-deployment verification in certain conditions. There's always going to be the residual risk that a unit doesn't actually perform in the same way as another unit. But what we're saying is that if you achieve stage 3 maturity, that risk is such that you can consider it a residual risk, really. and that you really have the opportunity to maintain traceable uncertainty only through a pre-deployment verification of the LiDAR unit, which can be onshore, of course, as opposed to having necessarily to go to full pre-deployment verification for the floating LiDAR unit. Specifically, what we're saying is that if your deployment conditions are such that the floating LiDAR unit hasn't changed, its setup hasn't changed from those previously trialed, and if your environmental conditions, including sea state, are enveloped by the conditions previously experienced in attaining stage 3 maturity, then you don't need to do a floating LiDAR system pre-deployment verification. You can rely, let's say, only or more fully on the LiDAR unit pre-deployment verification, which decreases the cost and time burden, of course. Now that does, that's a significant benefit to having achieved stage 3 maturity, I believe. It also begs the question, well, what if your floating LiDAR setup on that particular unit has actually changed slightly? What if the environmental conditions aren't quite enveloped by the studies that we've done before? Well, we're in the roadmap explaining that those are considerations that could be taken into account through an expert judgment, and the expert judgment may decide that a floating LiDAR system pre-deployment verification is still required because the excursion from what's been evaluated before is too great, or it may well decide that you can rely on a LiDAR unit only verification. So hopefully that's provided both an explanation of the benefits and the issues there, at which point I'll move on to the next slide. Okay, great. This next slide addresses the impact of design changes. The question that's been asked a number of times is, okay, having achieved a certain maturity for a type of floating LiDAR, it's inevitable that the floating LiDAR will develop. That's what the industry wants to see. That means its design isn't going to be static. So if we're assigning a maturity stage to a type, when does that type change and when does that type actually remain the same? So the roadmap explains a process there, which is summarized here. First of all, a floating LiDAR system design change is identified. We've got to recognize through configuration control when something has changed on the LiDAR. We then got to look at, does that design change actually affect the overall performance, both the accuracy and the reliability? In the roadmap, we provide some typical examples of components which have in the past been considered to be changed or actually changed, which have effectively resulted in the floating LiDAR system becoming a separate type. But that's not necessarily the case. What we're explaining is that an evaluation from suitably qualified and experienced party might well ascertain that, okay, there has been a component change, but through some kind of evaluation, which we don't stipulate, some kind of appropriate evaluation, a component or subsystem change could not actually affect the previous type assessment. And in principle, it doesn't matter which stakeholders actually action that process. So hopefully that's provided some clarity there. Obviously there are more details in the roadmap document itself, but at that point I will hand you over to my colleague Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Hello from my side. I hope you can hear me well. So, yeah, I see the correct slide. Yeah, the last key change we would like to introduce to you here in this webinar is a proposed framework to undertake floating LiDAR uncertainty calculations that comes now with a roadmap update. And as Detlef already mentioned in his part, it's not just a proposal coming as some informative part in the update. Well, as you heard, it's also a key requirement for reaching stage 3 to actually provide the uncertainty assessment of the floating LiDAR measurements. For those of you who still have version 1 of the roadmap well in mind, in the first version of the roadmap, we provided something like an indicative measurement uncertainty range for each of the 3 maturity stages. And this is actually something that is not in version 2, and why we will, or I will explain you in a minute. The industry evidence to date is actually described by the 2 points here. We can say that we have gained an improved understanding of floating LiDAR wind data uncertainty in the meantime, and with all these different trials and deployments that were mentioned in the beginning today. But we can also say that we are still lacking suitable evidence base to support the indicative ranges that were mentioned in version 1 of the roadmap. I wouldn't say that we see big contradictions, but it's simply not supporting exactly these ranges, and it's not supporting the whole idea that the stage 1, 2, 3 really tells you in a one-to-one correspondence that your measurements should have this kind of uncertainty level. Because of this, we decided to have in version 2 of the roadmap actually included this proposed framework to really perform case-specific uncertainty calculations. First, because this is needed for a complete resource assessment anyway, and second, because we don't think that it makes a lot of sense to simply refer to these pre-given ranges. The framework which we propose and which will I detail in some minutes is based on the IAA wind recommended practices on floating LiDAR that may be known to most of you, and this on the next step is well based on the IC standard for power curve assessment in the second edition, where you have the Annex L on performing LiDAR measurements and evaluating these LiDAR measurements. So it is not coming from somewhere, it is really based on current best practice and available standard guidelines. And as already mentioned, we propose with version 2 of the roadmap really to do this case-specific uncertainty calculations, perform them, and this is directly the requirement also for providing stage 3 floating LiDAR measurements in the end. An observation from us is that the results for uncertainty estimations are not really not really a driver of the maturity. Of course, the observed performance for a specific system is relating to further development of this technology, and it is not very likely that a technology is further developed that shows a not so good performance, so to say, in terms of accuracy. But what we have seen is that a system that is closer to stage 3 maybe does not necessarily show a better accuracy or a system that is more stage 2 and maybe has not been deployed in so many commercial projects so far, does not necessarily be less accurate than other systems. And on the other side, as I said, it is definitely required for stage 3 systems to include this uncertainty assessment for each deployment, for each wind resource assessment project. But the same framework, the same calculations and assessments can also already be applied for stage 2 systems, resulting in data of a similar quality and a similar purpose and use as a stage 3 system. So that's not really the basis to divide between stage 2 and stage 3 systems. So coming to the next slide. So I hope this is working now. Yeah, you should see it now. This slide actually should give you an overview of the uncertainty calculation framework that is further detailed in the roadmap update. And this graphic actually comes from the recommended practice document and is also to some extent already explained in that document. And most of the key ingredients really, as I said, come from the IC standard. You basically have two sides. So the final result is the uncertainty of the floating LiDAR measurements for the wind resource assessment, which is clearly here on the focus. And you have parts or uncertainty components coming both from the classification, which is something that is quite new now coming in with the roadmap, and you have the performance verification of the floating LiDAR unit. And what goes into this part, the verification part, is actually what most of you may know already from the trial evaluation that was already included in version 1 of the roadmap. So floating LiDAR performance verification can, for example, be the 6 months trial that is required for stage 2. It can also be a pre-deployment verification that is normally shorter, maybe only 4 weeks or 6 weeks duration. For those of you who don't have this in mind, the trial says you have a reference sensor, which is normally a MATMOS, but also can be a fixed LiDAR now, and you evaluate the differences between the reference and the floating LiDAR and get some values out of this, which then, according to the formulas you have also in the standard, give you the verification uncertainty. Then the classification comes in play, because the verification actually gives you the difference or the deviation from the reference system for a well-defined set of conditions, namely exactly the conditions you had under the verification trial. But since it could be that you deploy your instrument for the wind resource in a totally different wave and wind climate, you need to extrapolate these environmental conditions somehow, and for this is actually the purpose of a system classification. The system classification, and that was already mentioned by Detlef, is based on a set of trials, and we have simply overtaken the requirements from the IC guideline or IC standard, where it says that you should have results from at least 2 different units, individual instruments, at least 2 different locations, which gives you a minimum number of 3 individual trials. From these 3 trials, you do a so-called classification analysis. All the details are given in the standards, and derive essentially the sensitivities to the environmental conditions. And this is then again translated into an uncertainty using, and this is what is mentioned here, basically the averaged values of the significant environmental variables, and comparing these with the corresponding values during the deployment. The wind resource deployment gives you the final uncertainty estimate due to classification. So this is, I would say, a standard process. There are already first publications of how this can be applied to floating LiDAR data, and we really expect and hope that, because this is now published in the roadmap, that we will see more evidence of how this can be applied, see more results, and simply learn from it. And in the end, it's a requirement for stage 3, because only with this as complete as possible uncertainty estimate, you have well usable, applicable wind resource data for the final application. And this is really what is needed to to make the floating LiDAR bankable in the end. So much about uncertainties, and I think now I can give back to Marianne for the summary.
Yes, thank you, Julia, and thank you as well to Brian and Detlef for taking us through the key changes to the updated roadmap. So just a final summary slide from me then before we open up for questions. If I move on to the next slide. Thanks. Great. So, yeah, hopefully we've given you a flavour of the key changes to the roadmap. Obviously, the roadmap itself is available on the Carbon Trust website, alongside supplementary guidance notes. There'll be a lot more details in there. Essentially, what I'd like to sort of sum up by saying right now is that floating LiDAR systems are playing a key role in offshore wind farm developments today. It's underlined a requirement for us to bring the original roadmap up to current best practice and reflect current industry experience. There have been several changes made in version 2 of the roadmap, as summarized in this graphic here. So throughout the document, there have been updates, clarifications, extensions, and new material added. But we've talked through here today the 4 key changes as we see them that will be important to you as key industry stakeholders. So we had Detlef talk through the extension of stage 3 maturity definition. Brian then talked about pre-deployment verifications and a risk-based approach to that for systems that have reached stage 3, and also the impact of design changes. And then we had Julia talk through the guidance, the framework for assessing uncertainty in floating LiDAR systems. So with that, I think I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll hand back to Eloise and look forward to taking any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Marianne, Julia, Brian, Detlef. That was really informative. As I mentioned at the start, we have a lot of time for questions. So if you use your question panel on your webinar application, you should be able to ask questions if you have any. We have received one at the moment, and if possible, I'm going to ask this one of Detlef, so that all the panelists are open for questions. So Detlef, if you could answer the question, which is, are there any requirements on the third party to verify when you reach stage 3?
Yeah, thanks for this question. Well, first of all, quite clearly, the Carbon Trust, if I may speak just a moment on behalf of the Carbon is not willing to take the role of an independent assessor or a party to assign stage 3 to whatever system as an official authority and stuff like that. Furthermore, there is no, so to speak, accreditation for giving stage 3. So you can interpret that more or less everybody independently or being independent may be suitable to do the proper assessment and then make whatever stage 3 assignment or statement to a role, which in the end is more or less true. I mean, but I'd underline the fact that it really should be an experienced party which has the ability to fully, or has had the chance to fully understand the relevant documents behind that, which is of course the roadmap document as well as the recommended practice, I would say, and then go through all the prerequisites and check whether all the requirements, which hopefully have been formulated now quite specifically with all these requirements are met. And so, yeah, so it needs a well-informed, well-experienced, independent party that does that. Yeah, full stop.
Thanks, Detlef. Great. We received another question regarding the recommended practices. So now we've updated this roadmap, will there be a requirement? Is there likely to be an update to the recommended practice document? So I'll start off with that one. And I think speaking on behalf of the Carbon Trust and OWA's work in this area, I think we appreciate that reevaluating the roadmap has potentially brought us to the conclusion that now it's about time we revisit the recommended practices. But in our view, I think that will become more clear as people adopt the roadmap and start to use it. And we really encourage people to give us feedback and thoughts as they start to pick up this roadmap and use it in earnest. So we think there's potentially on the horizon and something that we're going to be looking at, but at the moment we're waiting to see how the roadmap is taken on board. Marianne, anything to add to that? That sounds all right.
I would agree with that, Eloise. Okay. Yeah. I don't know if Julie would want to add anything from sort of her perspective of the IEA recommended practices document, which is largely based, I believe, on the OWA.
Yeah, but I basically wanted to say the same. So the recommended practice is a separate document, and I think we try to make clear what's the difference actually between the roadmap and the recommended practice. And well, when it is required to make updates here, or if you have more material we can put in as recommendations into the recommended practice document, we will follow up here with IEA Wind and work on this.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Could I just comment a little bit further on that, if that's okay? I think since the recommended practice document that we all have was published, there have been some developments and clarifications associated with this OWA project to update the roadmap and with other projects. Those, off the top of my head, there's definitely been some improved articulation of the risk-based approach for pre-deployment verification, which we talked about today. It's not inconsistent with the recommended practice document, but there's definitely improved articulation now. And likewise, there's been a lot of good work done around classification. But having said that, there's nothing that's inconsistent, I would say, and the real majority of the work that is embodied in the recommended practice document, I still think is completely relevant and not out of date.
Great, thanks, Brian. We're getting some great questions in, so do keep them coming. We'll try and cover as many as we possibly can. A question here regarding the classification. Can we clarify, any of the panel members, can you clarify that the LiDAR itself, so the unfloating element of the LiDAR, the classification of that plays a large part in the floating classification?
I can comment on that, and I think probably Julia can as well. The LiDAR classification does appear, this comment is made on the basis of a small number of classification uncertainty evaluations, which we have worked on in the frame of another OWA project. The classification of the LiDAR device is important and appears in the uncertainty budget. For its relative magnitude compared to other things, I don't think we would expect it to be the dominant factor. I wonder if Julia has anything to...
Yeah, I think well, when you do an offshore classification, actually, as you do the offshore trial, you essentially look at your system as a kind of black box. So you simply compare the performance with the reference performance. And when you have all these trials offshore, you would directly compare your floating LiDAR system with the performance of the MADMARS, for example. And this would mean you would not include any information you have from a simple LiDAR onshore classification test. But the other alternative we have shown, actually what Brian introduced was a risk-based approach. There is some option to go around actually the offshore trialing and base more on onshore trials with a fixed LiDAR, and then you have to consider also something like an onshore classification. But this is really a lot dependent on the details of the uncertainty assessment, and is something that cannot it's not easy to give an answer here, because it depends directly on which way you go in the end.
Thanks, Julia.
I think to try to add a constructive comment further onto that, the work that we've done that's been alluded to there has really uncovered that it's important to think very carefully about how you perform the classification study for an offshore floating LiDAR, and that the choices that you make there could have a really big effect on the final resulting uncertainty. And actually, we'll be presenting those results at the Offshore Wind R&D conference in Bremerhaven in November, if anyone's particularly interested in that.
Thanks, Brian. We've got a question here for any of the panel members regarding environmental conditions. So, what is the recommended path if environmental conditions for a deployment of a stage 3 device are out with the historic experience envelope for a certain parameter? Can uncertainty still be calculated, estimated, or is a site-specific CE validation then required?
That's a good question. I think it's in the end it's a matter for judgment.
Yeah.
We don't have a sufficient evidence base to be more specific than that. It's clear that if your conditions are enveloped, then you can follow a particular classification uncertainty evaluation path. Of course, the question is what happens if they're not enveloped. Then we would say that an expert evaluation may well look at that and say, well, actually, that's pretty close. You can still follow the same procedure. Or an expert evaluation may say, actually, that's not pretty close. We need to do something else. We need to have some other less rationally quantified, in the end, route to evaluating that uncertainty, which is actually what's been happening to a certain extent already in assigning a classification uncertainty to systems which haven't undergone a full classification trial.
Thanks, Brian. A question here about stage 2. Can we imagine to reach stage 2 if month 1 and 2 do not reach the acceptance criteria, but month 3 to 8 achieve the acceptance criteria? So 6 months without interruption. Potentially one for Detlev.
Well, we have explicitly said now in the new roadmap that any verification trial that either counts for stage 3 and that inherently as well includes stage 2 requirements have to be relied on a consistent, uninterrupted campaign. I mean, it may still be prone to judgment whether you say, okay, the first two months was more or less a pre-test period for a certain stage, and then we declare the official stage starting on the second month, and then have a continuous verification for the remaining 6 months. So I tend to say that would be allowable, having in mind that in the early stages of the first roadmap applications with regards to stage 2 achievements, we even allowed some interruptions or putting together 2 or 3 campaigns to build the body of evidence for a total of 6 months campaigns, which we don't allow, or which is not allowed anymore now as of our interpretation. Yeah, but if you still have 6 months continuously showing good performance and meeting all KPIs, minimum acceptance criteria, then you should be fine for stage 2.
Thank you, Detlev. I'm very conscious that we're quickly running out of time, so I think we'll be able to fit 2 more questions in. One here from just talking about the international impact of the roadmap. So have we had any feedback from parties in the Americas and Asia, and whether the roadmap is likely to be accepted in these areas?
Yeah, so I might answer that quickly. So we know with the original roadmap that it is being looked at and considered in those markets. So I think as a quick response, we would expect the same to be the case for version 2 of the roadmap. As part of the dissemination of the updated roadmap, we've tried to throw the net quite wide and make sure that all key stakeholders, internationally are aware of this. So, but we would, of course, be interested in hearing feedback from users in those markets.
Okay.
If you allow me one comment here, I mean, there is still, we still see a clear risk in being that this roadmap, new stage requirements are applied too boldly from less inexperienced parties or industries, not being in Europe or the US, where automatically the stage requirements are put, for instance, in a tender and requiring this for a floating LiDAR system to be fulfilled, being aware of the fact that none of the systems yet is at this stage, and there's still room for interpretation as well outlined in the guidance note. I just like to emphasize that I hope people are careful enough when writing these new tenders.
Great, thank you. So unfortunately we've run out of time, and I want to encourage those who ask questions that we will get in. That we'll get in. We'll get back to you individually on the on email, because we have your contact details, and I'm aware that there was lots more questions that we didn't get to. So all I'd like to say is thank you for all dialing in. We had a great attendance and great in participation, and encourage you to get in touch with the Carbon Trust with any specific feedback. Happy to have a catch-up call or some email exchanges about some of the feedback, and hopefully we can continue to ensure that the successful uptake of the roadmap and continue to push floating LiDAR as an excellent solution for the offshore wind industry. So thank you all for attending, and hopefully engage with you again soon.